Out of the 53 nations that supported the United Nations resolution to help the Republic of Korea fend off the communist invaders, 16 eventually deployed combat forces. Australia was one of the earliest non-American nations to join the action. On June 30, 1950, Australian Prime Minister Menzies declared that 2 Australian Navy ships stationed in Japanese waters were now available to support the United Nations in aiding the Republic of Korea. The following day, July 1, 1950, in Canberra, the Prime Minister announced that Australia had offered No. 77 Squadron to serve alongside US forces in Korea. In Australia, on July 7, 1950, a specially summoned meeting of both houses of the federal parliament unanimously approved the government's action in placing naval and air units at the disposal of the United Nations in support of the Republic of Korea. The Prime Minister put the government's view in these words: "As we are subscribers not only to the letter but to the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, so we must be ready to give force and meaning to the letter and the spirit of the Charter. In one breath to speak of our allegiance to the Charter and in the next to ignore the resolution of the Security Council would be either hypocrisy or cowardice, of neither of which has Australia ever been adjudged guilty." On August 2, 1950, Australian Premier Menzies spoke to the United States House of Representatives. He pledged that Australian ground troops would be in Korea soon. He stressed the importance of time. On September 30, 1950, just 2 days after Seoul was retaken by ROK and US forces following the successful Incheon landing, the 3rd Australian Battalion, comprising 960 troops, joined the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade in the Songjueguan area, northwest of Taegu. The Australian soldiers, proud of their volunteer traditions, began their first operational patrols on October 2. On October 11, the main advance commenced, moving through rugged terrain in a narrow valley between high mountain ranges. The immediate objective of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, operating as part of the IUS Corps, was Kumcheon, approximately 30 kilometers north of the 38th parallel. On October 19, 1950, ROK and US forces captured Pyongyang with little resistance, continuing their advance toward the MacArthur Line, approximately 56 kilometers south of the Yalu River. By noon on October 21, the British Commonwealth Brigade crossed the Taedong River at Pyongyang as part of this advancement. Early on October 24, 1950, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, still leading the way, was tasked with securing a bridgehead across the Chongchon River at Sinanju. They were also assigned to capture Pakshan and Cheongju, key points on the routes from Pyongyang to the Manchurian border. As a result, the Australian troops crossed the river at the Unju Ford. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade's next target was Cheongju, situated near the western coast and approximately 60 kilometers from the Manchurian border. On October 29, Lieutenant Colonel Green, the commander of the 3rd Australian Battalion, was fatally wounded by enemy artillery shells that struck the command post area. He passed away while being transported to a surgical hospital in Unju. On October 30, 1950, the advance reached Cheongju, marking its furthest point. It was on this day that the troops learned of the Red Chinese invasion near the Manchurian border. This development shifted the tide of battle, turning communist defense into offense. It prompted a complete reassessment of the situation from the United Nations Command's perspective. Despite the decisive defeat of the Red North Koreans, the Communists committed a flagrant act of international lawlessness by secretly moving elements of Chinese Communist forces into North Korea from Manchuria. They amassed a significant concentration of potential reinforcing divisions with ample support behind the protected sanctuary of the nearby Manchurian border. By middle of November, bitter cold howled in from Siberia, and the temperature dropped below zero in a deep freeze, foretaste of winter to come. bitter winds began to moan down the frozen valleys. As the end-of-war offensive butted forward on November 24, 1950, the Australians were ordered in reserve. This luxury, however, did not last long. On November 27, as the front situation developed critical, the Australian and British troops were forced to pack up. On December 2, the Australians were ordered to move about 16 kilometers south and defend the new bridge under construction by U.S. engineers across the upper Taedong River, which flowed through Pyongyang to the Western Sea. The new bridge was intended to be an withdrawing route for the elements of Argylls and the 1st U.S. Cavalry Division who were engaging with the enemy at Unsananai area. When the Australians reached Apari, they encountered around 1,000 enemy troops positioned on and around a hill about 3,000 meters from the bridge. These enemies were already causing casualties among the American bridge builders. Despite heavy mortar and artillery fire, the Australian battalion, led by a company, launched an attack on the hill and quickly dispersed the enemy. The Australian withdrawal from Apari across the upper Taedong River began early on the morning of December 3. This retreat to Yeoli, a 50-kilometer journey in bitter cold, is remembered as the worst day in Korea by many men of the 3rd Australian Battalion. The following day, the Australians withdrew another 50 kilometers south to Sinj, where they came under the command of the 9 U.S. Corps. As the UNC ground forces continued to retreat steadily with the Communist Chinese in pursuit, the Australians left Sinji on December 8 for Sibiananai, and then on December 11 to Ujambu, which was 24 kilometers north of Seoul. The retreat had been an orderly withdrawal of more than 320 kilometers in 9 days. After the infamous retreat from Seoul, outpacing the Communists, the UNC forces flowed south. By the evening of January 7, 1951, the Australians, with its parent unit of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, reached Changhaonanai, approximately 110 kilometers south of Seoul. Beginning on January 25, 1951, the UN command made a cautious limited offensive Operation Thunderbolt within the elbow of the Han River and advanced about 27 kilometers north of its Suwon, Icon, Yeoju line, through a succession of phase lines. On February 14, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was ordered to cross the Han River at Yeoju and advanced to relieve the 23rd U.S. RCT and French Battalion who had been cut off in the Chipyeong-nae area. On February 20th, the 9 U.S. Corps received orders to encircle a sizable Communist force reportedly moving southeast of Wonju. Positioned on the right flank of the 9 U.S. Corps, the Australians encountered strong resistance at Hill 614, east of Chipyeong-nae, which stalled the brigade's advance for 4 days. On March 7, during Operation Ripper for Line Idaho-Chuncheon, Hongcheon, the Australians were tasked with cutting off the main supply route to Chuncheon, a town held by the Communists just below the 38th parallel. On March 13th, the day before UNC troops reclaimed Seoul, the Australians, along with their parent brigade, went into Corps Reserve near Chipyeong-nae for the first time in 6 months, staying there for about 10 days. On March 25th, the entire brigade fell under the operational command of the 24th U.S. Division at Tibori, located north of the Pukin River, approximately 48 kilometers northeast of Seoul. Over the next 2 weeks, the Australians were consistently near the front as part of a largely uneventful general advance by UNC forces across the 38th parallel. On April 5th, during the 8th U.S. Army's launch of Operation Rugged to establish Line Kansas along the 38th parallel, the Australians moved forward for the initial phase of the operation on April 13th. By April 15th, they had crossed the parallel again, engaging in combat to secure hills that were part of a ridge leading to Line Utah, just north of the 38th parallel. At Line Utah, the 19th Regiment of the 6th ROK Division took over from the British and Australians. Subsequently, the British and Australians entered Corps Reserve at Kapyong, situated on the Kapyong River, roughly 50 kilometers southeast of Line, Utah. Along the front the night of April 22nd, the Communist Chinese began their offensive. At the Central Front they hit the 6th ROK Division, west of Wachon, which had relieved the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade 5 days before. This was where the breakthrough occurred. An estimated 30,000 men of the 20th CCF Army pouring through the gap the 6th ROK Division had yielded between the 1st U.S. Marines and the 24th U.S. Division. Early morning of April 23, the British and Commonwealth battalions were ordered to take up blocking positions across the probable enemy approaches from the north. Australians were assigned a position along Hill 504, covering crossroads and over the Kapyong River and one of its small tributaries. After dark, the Red Chinese began to flood through the Kapyong Valley. Thus the famous Kapyong battle began, and heavy fighting continued throughout the night of April 23 and all next day. With an endless stream of reinforcements to throw in, the Communists kept coming in one after the other in a mad rush over their own dead and wounded in an attempt to break in. All night and all day the gallant Australian rifle companies had held their positions, exhausting and demoralizing the enemy, and gradually blunting the Chinese Communist offensive. In this combat the Australian cost was heavy. 31 killed, 58 wounded and 3 missing, afterwards known to be prisoners of war. But with support of the Canadian infantry, the American tanks and the New Zealand gunners, the Australian battalion was a major factor in halting the Reds' advance long enough for the UNC ground forces to reinforce the Kapyong River front. Following the disastrous defeat of the Communist forces in April and May, the fighting became stabilized close to the 38th parallel. With beginning of the truce negotiations on July 10, 1951, the United Nations Command had abandoned its political and military objective of winning the war, and the new phase of war, the static war, had begun. By the end of July 1951, the 3rd Australian Battalion was still the only Australian ground force in Korea, but the officers and men had turned over several times. Reinforcements were fed in rotation from a reinforcement holding unit in Japan. On July 28, 1951, the 28th British Commonwealth Brigade, including the Australian Battalion, came under the command of a newly formed 1st British Commonwealth Division, which began its operational life under the command of IUS Corps in the Western Sector. Ground operations in October 1951 were primarily of offensive nature, marked by an increased number of limited offensive attacks. The most biggest operation in scale in the autumn was Operation Commando, which began on October 3rd and aimed to buckle the enemy's defenses and establish a new forward UNC defense line, Jamestown. In this first major battle for the 1st British Commonwealth Division, the Australians under the 28th Brigade were to play a decisive role in the Battle of Mariangson Feature, in which Hills 355, 317 and 217 were enemy key defense points. The new front, line Jamestown, was about 20 kilometers north of 38th parallel. Here the Australians spent next few weeks consolidating the new positions. After spending some time in reserve, the 28th Brigade, including the Australians, returned to the front line on January 18, 1952. Positioned on the western slopes of Hill 355, also known as Cowling Sand or Little Gibraltar, the Australians were dug in on the brown hilltops overlooking 5 layers of barbed wire and minefields leading to the valley below, where the Communist defense lines were located. Each day, at dawn and dusk, the entire battalion remained on high alert for about an hour, anticipating potential attacks during the times favored by the Chinese Communists. Soldiers not on alert duty typically had a couple of hours of rest in sheltered quarters. At night, patrols ventured out through the wire and minefields to assess the enemy's defenses. On April 3, the 1st Australian Battalion, the 2nd Australian Contingent, arrived Korea and moved into the 1st British Commonwealth Division area during the second week in April. Upon completion of a 6-week period of intensive training, the battalion moved into the front line to take its place with the 3rd Australian Battalion on June 1. The battalion claimed the honor of its first operational engagement on June 19. In fact, the line was particularly quiet and, despite intermittent shelling, the new Australians suffered no casualties until June 22, when an ambush patrol lost 1 man. On July 2, a daylight raid on the notorious enemy-held Hill 227 was the first major operation for the 1st Battalion. Although the assault party could not take a prisoner, they destroyed the bunkers and used flamethrowers with telling effect on the enemy. Except for a couple of days in reserve, the 1st RAR Battalion remained at the sharp end of the area until September 25. On the night of December 10, in freezing weather, the 1st Battalion, with the cooperation of 3rd Battalion, sent its B Company deep into the enemy positions and extricated his men skillfully when they had completed a successful assault. The remaining months of the year had gone with no particular incidents, except carrying out the monotonous, nerve-wracking stand-to and patrol routine at platoon to company strength during the night. At the end of January 1953, as the 1st British Commonwealth Division was relieved on the line by the 2nd US Division, the Australians moved into the Camp Casey in Tondakan, where it would remain for over 2 months as a 1st US Corps Reserve. On March 17, the 1st units of the 2nd Australian Battalion, the 3rd Australian Contingent, arrived in Korea to replace the 1st RAR Battalion. The 1st RAR Battalion had completed its year-long deployment in Korea since April 1952 and departed for Australia at the end of March 1953. In early April, the 1st British Commonwealth Division returned to its previous sector on the Western Front to replace the 2nd US Division. During the nights of April 6 to 9th, the 28th Brigade, with the Australian battalions, the 3rd and 2nd, assumed positions around Hill 355 in the division's right sector. The week-long Operation Little Switch started on the morning of April 20th. When it concluded on April 26th, the Communists had released 684 prisoners of war, including 5 Australians. April had passed with no particular incidents to note for the Australians. On May 4th, the 2nd RAR Battalion went into the line for the first time in the area along southwest of Hill 355, including Hill 159 near Chomao. Hereafter, the battalion stayed in line Jamestown until June 16th, when it turned over the sector to its sister battalion, the 3rd, and moved into the blocking positions as a brigade reserve. On July 9th, the 2nd Australian Battalion was again in the forward line, in the Hook Salient, known as a troublesome sector on Samichop River, the boundary with the 1st U.S. Marine Division on its left. Jutting as it did towards the Communist lines, the salient formed a J-shaped bulge in the main line which established the vulnerability of the position, and the ridgeline on which the Hook was located continued northwest into Communist-held territory, lay only about 500 yards northwest of the Hook. Aware of its tactical weight, the Communists had made repeated attempts to capture this area, but without success, and towards the end of July, the Red Chinese launched another major attack. The main objective was a feature in the U.S. Marine sector, but Australians were also under attack. During this abortive action, which continued until early morning of July 27th when the truce was signed, the Australians displayed fully the pride of their volunteer tradition and marked the final activity of the Australian battalions in the Korean War. When the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, the Australian battalions were in the Hook sector and taken up with preparing for the evacuation of forward positions. The 2nd Battalion moved out at 1,000 hours on July 30th. The 3rd Battalion remained in Korea for several more months after the arrival of the 1st Battalion. Australian forces remained in Korea as part of the multinational peacekeeping force until 1957. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to leave any questions or topics you'd like us to address in the comments below. Thank you.